I am Elena, a 25-year-old data analyst. The threat sounded like a standard family guilt trip. But it was actually the fatal mistake that would permanently bankrupt their golden boy. My mother cornered me in the kitchen, slammed his financial notes onto the counter, and snapped. Code his app for free by morning, or your health insurance gets cut off on Monday. My father stepped in right behind her, crossing his arms tight. Don't be selfish, Elena. He needs this startup more than you need your monthly pills. I didn't scream. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled and quietly tucked my mother's handwritten medication schedule into my jacket pocket. They were absolutely confident that my chronic illness left me completely trapped. What they didn't realize was what I was preparing to project on the main screen in front of 40 VIP investors at his funding dinner. This is that story. If your family ever demanded gratitude for what was actually extortion, this is for you. Please like, subscribe, and comment your listening location and local time. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. When I was diagnosed with a chronic autoimmune condition at 19, my mother didn't hold my hand in the clinic. She took out a notepad, calculated the price of my monthly injections, and laid the total on the kitchen table. For 6 years, that number was the invisible price tag hanging over my head. Every dinner conversation, every family holiday, my mother would remind me how my medical bills were starving the family. They made sure I grew up believing my very existence was a debt I could never fully repay. So, when my mother cornered me at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, her eyes weren't filled with worry for my health. They were cold, sharp, and demanding. She tossed a thick stack of printed financial notes onto my desk, the paper slapping hard against my laptop. My younger brother, Leo, walked into the room right behind her, holding a bottle of sparkling water. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes glued to his phone screen as he took a slow sip. Make sure the pitch deck looks like a Fortune 500 presentation by 6 in the morning. Elena, Leo said without looking up at me. I have 40 accredited investors coming to the VIP dinner at the Grand Hotel on Friday, and my data metrics need to look flawless. My mother nodded, her hand resting heavily on his shoulder with a warmth she had never once shown me. If you refuse, or if you complain, your father and I are calling the insurance company tomorrow, she said, her voice dropping to a flat, dangerous whisper. You turn 26 next year, but we can drop you from our policy before sunrise. Let's see how long your lungs last when a single box of medication costs $1,200 out of pocket. I didn't yell. I didn't beg her to remember the nights I spent in emergency rooms while she complained about the co-pays. In our house, anger was a luxury reserved for the people who paid the bills. And my parents had spent 6 years convincing me I was a permanent drain on their resources. Instead, I reached out. Picked up the handwritten medication schedule my mother had penned 3 years ago, the tiny square of paper with her neat cursive listing my morning pills, and slid it into my jacket pocket. My mother smirked, taking my silence for compliance. She believed she had me backed into a corner where my choices were simple: surrender my intellect for free, or forfeit my life. They walked out of my room, leaving the door wide open as Leo laughed at something on his phone down the hallway. I waited until the house went dark at 1 in the morning before I opened my laptop. For 6 months, I had been working quietly as a senior data analyst at a global enterprise logistics firm in the city. My day job consisted of cleaning corrupted databases, tracing untracked capital flow, and finding the single misaligned entry in an ocean of 100,000 spreadsheets. Numbers do not lie. They do not manipulate. And they do not demand emotional gratitude. I logged into my personal online banking portal and pulled up 36 months of exported CSV transaction records. Every single month. On the 15th. Without fail, I had transferred exactly $500 into my mother's personal checking account. She had called it my survival contribution, the extra fee she claimed the insurance company charged to keep a high-risk chronic patient on the family plan. For 3 years, I had cut my own grocery budget, worn shoes with thin soles, and skipped meals just to make sure that $500 was in her account every 4 weeks. But tonight, I didn't just look at my cent transfers. I opened the shared family utility ledger that my mother accidentally synced to our old cloud drive 2 years ago. A raw database she never knew how to clean or lock down. I ran a simple cross-referencing query, matching the timestamp of my monthly $500 deposits against her outgoing bank transfers. The data cleared in less than 3 seconds. Every month, within 48 hours of my $500 arriving, my mother executed a wire transfer of the exact same amount to an external account labeled Apex Ventures LLC. Apex Ventures wasn't an insurance carrier or a medical clearinghouse. It was the unregistered business bank account my parents had secretly set up for my brother Leo's startup entity. My mother had never paid a single extra dollar to the insurance company for my medical coverage. She had been taking my monthly $500, the money I bled for. The money I thought was keeping me alive, and funneling it directly into Leo's pocket to pay for his designer suits, his pitch meetings, and his luxury apartment deposits. They weren't just exploiting my labor to write his code, they were stealing my survival funds to dress up their golden son as a prodigy. The realization didn't make my hands shake. It didn't make tears fall onto my keyboard. It simply turned the remaining warmth in my chest into cold, quiet ice. They believed they held my life hostage behind an insurance card, unaware of the secret I had been keeping in my desk drawer for 6 months. What my mother didn't know was why I kept quietly transferring that $500 even after I landed my corporate job. I closed the spreadsheet, saved the verified audit trail into an encrypted folder, and stared at the glowing screen. Now, I didn't just have an obligation to finish Leo's pitch deck. I had every reason to make sure it was unforgettable. At 2:15 on Wednesday morning, my bedroom was lit only by the cold blue glow of my dual monitors. My phone on the desk vibrated every 4 minutes, buzzing against the wood with relentless efficiency. It was Leo sending a barrage of frantic text messages. "Where is the user acquisition slide?" his message read. "Stop slacking. You useless burden. If mom cuts your insurance off tomorrow, don't come crying to me." I didn't reply to a single message, nor did I let my hands shake. Instead, I kept my fingers moving across the mechanical keyboard, taking every insult as the necessary price of admission. To build his presentation from scratch, Leo had been forced to give me full administrative read and write credentials to his startup's raw cloud repository. For 5 straight hours, I accepted his verbal abuse through text as I navigated through his back-end directory. Every hour without sleep made my joints ache from my autoimmune condition. But the physical pain was a distraction I could easily afford. Deep inside the server's unencrypted subfolders, I pulled up Apex Ventures LLC's master accounting ledger, investor cap tables, and burn rate logs. The raw transaction files confirmed what my bank account had already told me. Leo's startup had been using my monthly $500 medication payments to keep its operational account afloat. I didn't just organize his metrics. I systematically integrated my own encrypted audit layer into the master presentation file that would be projected on Friday night. At 5:45 a.m., as gray morning light filtered through my blinds, my mother opened my bedroom door without knocking. She stood over my shoulder, holding a mug of black coffee she had no intention of sharing, her eyes scanning my screen for finished charts. "Your father and I talked," she said, her voice dry, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. "We're giving you until Friday night after the pitch dinner. If Leo doesn't secure his $500,000 angel round because your data looks weak, we're calling the broker on Monday morning. Specialty injections cost $2,100 a box without our policy. Elena, let's see how well you analyze data from a hospital bed." I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, my face showing nothing. I slowly slid my hand into my top desk drawer, my fingers brushing past the faded plastic of my old family insurance card. Right underneath it lay a sleek, silver-embossed piece of heavy plastic Global Logistics Corp Executive Platinum Healthcare Plan. 6 months ago, when I passed my probationary period as a senior data analyst, my corporate employer had quietly enrolled me in an executive benefit package. It covered 100% of my specialty treatments, my specialty prescriptions, and emergency visits with a $0 deductible. I had received the physical card 5 months ago, but I had kept it buried in my drawer, never uttering a single word to my parents. I knew how toxic family systems operated. As a data analyst, I understood that if I revealed my independence too early, they would simply pivot to a new vulnerability, manufacturing another crisis to keep me obedient. I needed them to believe their extortion weapon was still pressed firmly against my temple until the exact moment I chose to pull the curtain back. My mother smirked, convinced her threat had successfully subjugated me for another 48 hours, and slammed my bedroom door shut. I picked up the platinum card, feeling the cold, heavy plastic under my thumb. Their weapon was dead air, their leverage was worthless paper. I looked back at my monitor, where the clean, finalized pitch deck sat ready for Friday's VIP dinner at the Grand Hotel. Now, I possessed my absolute shield, completely immune to their emotional blackmail. But as I attempted to execute a final test run of the presentation script, an unexpected error code flashed across my screen in bright red text. Leo's technical co-founder had just updated the server security, establishing an encrypted admin firewall for Friday night's event system. If I couldn't bypass their secondary security clearance before Friday evening, my hidden audit slides would remain locked inside my local drive, and their lies would walk out of that ballroom with $500,000 of stolen capital. By Thursday evening at 7 p.m., the technical firewall Leo's co-founder installed was fully operational. Every remote administrative entry required a 2-factor token sent directly to Leo's personal phone. But they had built their security system under a foolish assumption. They assumed I was trying to break into their server from the outside, like a hacker trying to bypass a lock. As a senior data analyst, I knew the cleanest exploits don't force a locked door. They walk through the front entrance inside an approved payload. I opened the core presentation file on my workstation, the 3-gigabyte deck containing Leo's financial projections and market research. Using a Visual Basic script embedded inside the master slide master, I bound my audit report directly to his third slide, the slide titled Seed Capital and Initial Angel Allocations. I set a conditional trigger based on the presentation timer. The moment slide 3 remained on the screen for more than 10 seconds, the embedded macro would automatically unhide 48 months of cross-referenced bank statements, displaying every $500 wire transfer my mother had funneled into Apex Ventures. As I finalized the code, I ran a background check on the 40 accredited investors listed on Leo's VIP guest list. Sitting at table 1 as the anchor investor was Arthur Vance, a legend in regional venture capital. Vance was notorious across the entire state for a zero-tolerance policy regarding financial discrepancies. 2 years ago, he had publicly pulled a $2 million term sheet from a tech startup and blacklisted the founder permanently after discovering a $5,000 accounting irregularity in their preliminary audit. Leo had spent 3 months begging Vance for 10 minutes of his time, completely oblivious to the fact that Vance hated financial dishonesty more than he hated failed business models. At 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, exactly 2 hours before the pitch dinner at the Grand Hotel, the door to my room swung open. Leo walked in, accompanied by a young man in a cheap suit, his newly hired event assistant, Mark. Without saying a word, Leo grabbed my laptop off the desk, logged into the cloud console, and revoked my administrative credentials right in front of my face. Change of plans, Elena, Leo said, a smug grin spreading across his face as he tapped a new password into his phone. You're not touching the tech console tonight. Hand over the USB drive with the final deck. My mother stepped into the doorway behind them, holding a freshly ironed suit jacket for Leo. She gave me a cold, warning look. Mark will handle the projection system from the sound booth, my mother said, her voice dropping into that familiar, venomous quiet. You will walk in through the staff entrance, sit at the back table near the kitchen, and keep your mouth shut. You're there to carry Leo's spare brochures, not to ruin his night. I didn't argue. I didn't reach for my laptop or plead for my seat at the main table. In family dynamics built on extortion, the tyrant always mistakes silent compliance for absolute defeat. I quietly reached into my bag, pulled out the heavy titanium USB drive containing the master presentation, and placed it directly into Mark's open palm. Leo laughed, slapping Mark on the shoulder as they turned and walked down the hallway toward the garage. What my brother failed to realize was that losing direct control over the server was the very thing that made my trap flawless. By forcing his assistant to run the file locally from the sound booth, he had eliminated any chance of remote cancellation. At 6:30 p.m., I walked through the side doors of the Grand Hotel ballroom. 40 VIP investors in crisp tuxedos sat at round white linen tables, their wine glasses catching the amber light of the chandeliers. Arthur Vance sat at table 1, unrolling his leather notebook. Mark was already plugging my titanium USB drive into the main projector console, completely unaware of what was ticking inside the third slide. At 7:30 p.m., the lights inside the Grand Hotel ballroom finally dimmed to a soft amber. I stood completely still in the shadows by the kitchen doors, clutching a stack of spare brochures. Leo walked to the center of the stage, pausing perfectly to let the applause from the 40 VIP investors wash over him. But he didn't start with his market projections or his software architecture. He smiled, lowered his head in feigned humility, and handed the microphone directly to our mother. She stepped into the spotlight, wearing a tailored navy dress paid for by my stolen medical transfers. She looked out over the sea of wealthy venture capitalists, intentionally catching the eye of Arthur Vance at table 1. When you build a company, you build it on sacrifice, my mother began, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. 3 years ago, my daughter was diagnosed with a severe chronic illness. The specialty medications were devastatingly expensive. As a family, we made a choice. We quietly drained our savings, skipped meals, and lived on the bare minimum just to afford the $500 every month to keep her breathing. I stood in the back of the room, listening to the woman who had weaponized my illness paint herself as a martyr. The most casual thieves are the ones who contribute nothing, yet aggressively hoard the credit to decorate their savior masks in public. She hadn't paid a single medical bill in 6 years. She had taken my money to fund Leo's luxury apartment. Yet she stood under the crystal chandelier, wearing my survival as a badge of honor. The room fell completely silent, captivated by her elaborate lie. Several investors nodded deeply, their faces softening with genuine respect. Arthur Vance actually put down his pen and applauded. The sound of 40 wealthy men and women clapping for my mother's fake sacrifice felt like physical blows against my chest. My throat burned, and my nails dug so hard into my palms they almost broke the skin. But I forced myself to swallow the humiliation and keep my face blank. I knew I couldn't just rely on Mark, Leo's assistant, to leave the third slide on the screen long enough to trigger my hidden macro. If Mark panicked and clicked next, the bank statements would vanish before Vance could read the numbers. I pulled my phone from my pocket, keeping it shielded below my waist. While reviewing the cloud logs earlier that afternoon, I had noticed the hotel's audiovisual vendor used an unencrypted local IP address for their remote casting software. It took me less than 40 seconds to type the default admin credentials into my browser and bypass the local firewall. A tiny green light flashed on my screen. I was in. I quietly severed Mark's Bluetooth connection from the sound booth, locking the projector's control panel and routing the master override directly to my phone. Mark tapped his laptop aggressively in the corner, his face turning pale. But it was too late. I now held the screen hostage. On stage, my mother wiped a fake tear from her cheek and smiled warmly at the audience. Now, my son Leo will show you exactly how our family's perseverance translates into this incredible business model, she announced proudly. She was soaking in the peak of her fabricated glory, absolutely convinced she had won the room. My thumb hovered over the remote trigger button on my screen, waiting to see how fast they would fall from this great height. Leo took the microphone from our mother, beaming at the applause. He clicked his wireless presenter, expecting his sleek title slide to appear. Behind him, the massive LED screen flashed black for a fraction of a second. I pressed the trigger button on my phone. The screen didn't show his revenue projections. It displayed a massive, high-definition spreadsheet, highlighting 48 months of banking transactions in bright crimson. At the very top, in bold 50-point font, read the title I had added at 3 a.m, Apex Ventures LLC, unauthorized patient extortion funds. The ballroom fell into a dead, heavy silence. 40 wealthy investors stopped drinking their wine and squinted at the screen. Arthur Vance leaned forward, pulling his reading glasses from his breast pocket. He was looking directly at the repeating column showing exactly $500 moving from my personal account to my mother's account, and then, immediately, into Leo's startup fund. Leo tapped his presenter frantically, his thumb clicking the plastic button 5 times in rapid succession. The slide did not move. In the sound booth, Mark was slamming his hands against his keyboard, but my network override had locked him out completely. I stepped out of the shadows. I didn't rush. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom, passing between the white linen tables. Every head turned to watch me. I stopped right in front of the main stage, standing less than 10 feet from where my mother was frozen. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy, silver-embossed Global Logistics Platinum Healthcare card. I didn't throw it at her. I simply tossed it onto the polished oak table directly in front of Arthur Vance. The heavy plastic made a sharp, distinct crack against the wood. "I have been a senior data analyst for 6 months," I said, my voice perfectly level, projecting clearly into the quiet room. "My corporate policy covers 100% of my medical expenses with a $0 deductible. I have not cost this family a single penny." My mother stared at the silver card. Her mouth opened, but only a dry gasp came out. "If my company pays for my medication," I asked, looking directly into her eyes, "where exactly did my $500 go this morning?" She tried to speak. She couldn't form words. Her fingers went completely limp. The heavy microphone slipped from her hand and hit the stage floor. A piercing burst of static feedback screamed through the ballroom speakers, making several investors wince and cover their ears. My mother didn't even bend down to pick it up. She just stood there, her shoulders collapsing inward, her face draining to the color of ash. Leo was faring worse. He stumbled backward away from me. His shoulder blades slammed hard into the LED screen displaying his theft. He was sweating heavily, his chest heaving, his jaw working up and down without producing a single sound. The most satisfying vengeance is never a loud argument. It is shining a cold, surgical light on a happy family facade right in front of the people they are desperate to buy. Arthur Vance picked up my platinum card, looked at the screen, and then looked at Leo. The disgust on the older man's face was absolute. He didn't see a brilliant tech founder anymore. He saw a parasite who financed his ambition by stealing from his sick sister. The silence in the room wasn't just awkward. It was a financial execution. I did not wait for an apology I knew would never come. I turned my back on my family while they were still trapped under the blinding lights of the stage. As I walked toward the exit, the murmurs from the VIP tables grew louder, shifting from confusion to outright anger. The trap had snapped shut, leaving them with no defense and nowhere to hide. But as I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, the real question was what Vance and the other 40 investors were going to do with their checkbooks. I paused just outside the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, keeping my hand flat against the cool metal as I looked back inside. I did not need to stand in the center of the room to witness the absolute destruction of my brother's carefully constructed empire. Arthur Vance stood up from table 1, the sharp scrape of his wooden chair echoing violently through the dead, heavy silence of the room. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone carried the crushing weight of a financial executioner delivering a final verdict. "I have overlooked aggressive accounting in the past, and I have forgiven missed quarterly projections," Vance said, calmly buttoning his tailored suit jacket. "But I will never fund a man who builds his seed capital by extorting a sick family member's medical fund." Vance picked up his leather notebook, turned his back on the glowing LED screen, and began walking toward the main exit. The anchor investor had officially spoken. And in the regional venture capital world, a public blacklisting from Arthur Vance was a terminal diagnosis. Like a perfectly synchronized avalanche, the remaining 39 investors stood up from their tables in unison. You could hear the snapping of briefcases and the rustling of coats as they packed up without asking a single question or touching their expensive wine. The karmic mirror had shattered right in front of them, revealing that the brilliant tech prodigy was nothing more than a parasite. Within 4 excruciating minutes, $500,000 in promised angel capital evaporated into thin air. Leo finally found his voice, stumbling off the stage and desperately chasing after the exiting crowd of executives. "Mr. Vance, please wait. The user acquisition metrics are still incredibly solid. We can restructure the equity right now," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Vance didn't even break his stride, waving a hand dismissively in the air as he walked right past me and out into the lobby. The grand VIP dinner, funded entirely by my stolen medication money, was rapidly reduced to a cavernous room of empty chairs and abandoned business cards. My brother collapsed into a chair at table 1, burying his face in his hands as the reality of his permanent financial ruin finally set in. His startup was dead on arrival, permanently incinerated by the very greed that funded it. I lingered in the shadows of the doorway for one final moment, watching the 3 of them isolated in the massive, silent ballroom. A tiny, foolish part of me, the fragile daughter who had dutifully sent $500 every single month, waited for my mother to look up. I waited for the horrified realization to wash over her face, for her to run down the aisle and beg for my forgiveness for using my survival as a weapon. Instead, my mother fell to her knees next to Leo's chair, gripping his arm and weeping uncontrollably into his jacket sleeve. "All that capital, all those connections, it's completely gone," she wailed, rocking back and forth as if she were mourning a physical death. My father paced angrily in front of the glowing bank statements on the screen, cursing the investors for being too short-sighted to recognize Leo's unmatched genius. They were entirely consumed by the loss of the golden child's ambition, completely unbothered by the fact that they had actively gambled with my life. Not a single one of them looked toward the door, and no one uttered a single word of remorse for the extortion. The blistering satisfaction of the revenge slowly settled into a heavy, freezing truth in my chest. I let the heavy brass door swing shut behind me, severing the pathetic noise of their panic, and walked out into the cool night air. I drove back to my apartment in complete silence, leaving the windows rolled halfway down to let the freezing night air fill the car. My phone sat in the cup holder, its screen remaining dark for the entire 40-minute drive. There were no frantic text messages apologizing for the extortion, and no missed calls from my mother begging for forgiveness. The silence was absolute, confirming the irreversible truth I had spent 6 years trying to avoid. They had never loved me. They had only loved the $500 my illness generated, and the obedient victim my fear had created. I walked up to my unit and unlocked the door to an apartment that was finally, truly mine. The heavy chains of financial blackmail were shattered, giving me total control over my life. But the quiet emptiness of the living room felt exceptionally cold. I walked straight through the dark apartment and pushed open the sliding glass door to my small balcony. The city lights flickered below, but I kept my eyes focused on the metal railing. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the tiny, folded square of paper my mother had written 3 years ago. It was the medication schedule, carefully penned in her neat cursive. A paper I had once cherished as a symbol of maternal care. Under the pale glow of the street lamps, it just looked like a ransom note. I didn't cry, and my hands didn't tremble as I stared at the faded ink. I pulled a silver lighter from my pocket, struck the flint, and touched the small orange flame to the bottom corner of the paper. I stood perfectly still in the freezing wind, watching the fire eat through the written days of the week, reducing her fake devotion into black, curling ash. The heat licked at my fingertips before I dropped the burning remnants into the metal ashtray, watching the final embers die out like a discarded piece of trash. I had secured my health and my future on my own terms. But the phantom ache of knowing I never really had parents would always remain. I took a deep, steadying breath of the cold night air, filling my lungs completely for the first time in 6 years. Gratitude demanded for stolen air is just extortion. You only breathe freely when you pay for your own oxygen.